Bom, pessoal, estamos chegando aí a mais um Keynote e vocês sabem que esse Keynote está substituindo o David Anderson, então é uma grande responsabilidade aí para o Todd e o Joey fazer essa substituição, mas eu realmente acredito que eles vão poder aí entregar um conteúdo interessante, porque eu venho conversando principalmente com o Todd a respeito de diversos assuntos que eles vão apresentar. Eu aproveitei esse momento que, já que o Todd e o Joey vão substituir o David, coloquei ali na pauta coisas que eu julgo que são interessantes e que têm impactado o mercado global, mas, na minha opinião, também aqui no Brasil. Tá? So, guys, I just talk to them about what we are expecting from your talk, from your keynote. And I think that you can introduce yourselves and then you can get started.
Well, very good. Thank you, Rodrigo. And it's great to be able to participate here in Kanban Brazil. So I'm Todd Little. I'm chairman of Kanban University, and I'm joined today by Joey Spooner, who is the VP of Community and Product Development for Kanban University. And today we'd like to talk about the preventable pandemics. In particular, stopping the transformationitis and the reorganizationitis that we see that's taking over. So what are the things we're seeing? What's the first pandemic? It seems a lot of organizations have this, oh, let's just go be agile or whatever the thing of the day is. And the response seems to be, let's do a transformation. Well, how does that work? So we go ask someone, how's your transformation going? Response, which one do you mean? We have 4 or 5 of them ongoing simultaneously. And this was an agile coach at a large food services supplier. You know, how can you have a transformation? How can you have 4 or 5 of these transformations? And how many of them are going to be successful? Our second pandemic is let's just be agile and let's reorganize. Often these two come together. The transformation followed by the reorganization. It's just these common patterns that we're seeing. And what happens here? We've had 6 reorganizations in the past 6 quarters. It's just inevitable. We have reorganization happening all the time, and these things are highly disruptive and often fairly insignificant in creating results. If we look at some organizational structures, all sorts of different organizational structures here. This is a mock-up of some ideas, but there's some truth to these organizational structures and how these large organizations work. And I've lived in organization structures somewhat like this in many cases. But what do they all have in common? Well, all of these companies are hugely successful. So why would we go around trying to find this magical organization structure that works? I mean, the reality is that many times it's not the organization structure, it's something else entirely that we need to be solving. Yeah.
And with that in mind, it's worth noting that most of these transformations are doomed to fail. 70%, that's quite a big number. And that's from John Kotter within the Harvard Business School. So the reality to John Kotter was he had thought 70% would fail. And we found that recently, HBR, the Harvard Business Review, published an article on the secret behind successful corporate transformations recently, this past month, I believe. And they found that only 22% of companies in their analysis even transformed themselves. So this is not easy. So we tend to think here that Kotter was an optimist, right? He thought this would be easy to do, at least somewhat, 30%, and it's really more like 22% or less. So, we have these thoughts sometimes, if only we could change a little bit, if only we could do something different here.
If only.
We had senior executive support, right? Easy.
If only.
People didn't resist change. I mean, why not? It's not that hard.
If only.
There was more trust in the organization. Why don't we just get that figured out?
If only.
We had better OKRs. I mean, why not? OKRs are easy.
If only.
Teams are willing to collaborate with each other. That's all it takes is just conversation, right?
If only
we had more leadership. I mean, that's all it needs. Leadership is easy.
If only
we had fewer dependencies. That's all. Simply map out the dependencies, do some yarn, put them together and go, that's it. We've solved the problem.
If only
customers were more responsive. They just need to talk to us. That's all that needs to happen here.
If only
we could better prioritize. We had better fine-grained requirements and stories. That's simple. If we had direct access to customers, we could pick up the phone and call them. If priorities didn't change so frequently, if planning wasn't such a pain in the rear end, if it was just easy to do.
Yeah, if only
we didn't measure the wrong things. We were organized differently. That's all it takes. And if we had T-shaped people who were specialists who could go deep on something, if we had true cross-functional teams, teams that collaborated and got together and worked together and were friends. Oh, and if we had capacity when we needed it, that would be so much better. And capacity is so easy to measure out.
If only
we can get everyone together and hold a facilitated discussion. That's all it needs. We just need a good facilitator.
If only facilitated discussions actually fixed any of these problems.
So this is wishful thinking.
So let's look at why it's wishful thinking. Why are transformations such a challenge? The issue here is that if we look at the mode, the traditional transformation, it's an A to B process. It starts with the current process, map out some idea of what the future process ought to look like, and presto, we have a transformation. The problem here is that in order for this to work, we have to really fully understand what the future process looks like. It has to be mapped out in advance. So effectively, these transformations, and many of these so-called agile transformations, are in fact big bang design upfront transformations, which is such ironic because agile knows that big design upfront doesn't work, yet so many transformations are done that way. And this is one of the primary reasons why these fail. There's another reason why these transformations fail frequently. So to get big design up front. So the other reason why these transformations fail is that people do not resist change, they resist being changed. There's an element here that in order for us to have a transformation, we need a lot of things to happen. And so people say, oh, they just need to change. People just need to change. And that's not the issue. People have their ways and they have good reasons why they work their certain ways. And they don't adapt. They don't make change drastic change very fast. And this is something that came out from studies done by Daniel Kahneman, who wrote the book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the two ways of learning are one of learning by experience, and the other is learning by theory. And learning by experience is things like sensory perception, pattern matching, things like learning a route that you're going to drive. You learn that route to drive and you match it by patterns. It's very fast. You know the pattern, you continue it. As you gain that experience, you just continue to operate in that way. The learning by theory is more of understanding all the computation, all the data, and using logical inference to make decisions. So great, we know that there's these two ways of operating, and this is how we process information. How we process change, humans invariably are dealing with change in a system one. It's an emotional response. They need to have their patterns. They have to adjust their patterns, and for their patterns to adjust, it needs to happen slowly. And these have to happen very much with addressing emotional issues. Whereas if we're silicon-based life forms, they could change very rapidly. We can just say, let's just throw in a new program and it does something new for us. that doesn't work in how we do change with humans. So these big bang transformations will have a challenge because they're taking on too much change for many humans to take on. And what we know is behind nearly every logical excuse to change is an emotional response. So we have to be dealing with these things from an emotional perspective, not from trying to solve things with logic. Very rarely will that work. We need something new.
Yeah, and people need a humane approach to change, Todd. I think you got a good point there. And that's what we're here about at Kanban University. They need to know what to do, but not to be told what to do. And they need to have a confidence that suggested actions are going to work for them, that they're not just going to flail and have a hard time here. So what we look at here at Kanban University is pragmatic, actionable, evidence-based guidance, stuff that works from the field that we take and share with the rest of our community here. And in particular, evolutionary change is humane. That's something that we pay attention to a lot here. It's meant to respect the human being and their psychology and how they think through and how they respond to and how they evolve to effectively the change in their environment.
So if we look at evolutionary change and we look back at our how we're operating with our capability over time, we have a starting point. So we have a starting point that's on our chart here. And we have an idea of where, Joey, can you update? Yeah. Current state. And then we have some idea of a future state that we're going to be looking at, where we'd like to get to. We think it's a direct path, but in fact, what happens is it's not a direct path. We go through what's called a J-curve. Virginia Satir made this very famous in discovering, working with families, addictive families, and how when they initially introduced a change in the system, that things actually got worse before they got better. And over time, we've discovered that this happens in general in business and all sorts of change initiatives, is that things get worse before they get better. And we have two challenges here. One is safety. How much worse is it going to get? And how long is it going to take for us to get through this situation that we have here? How long is it going to take before we actually revert back to where we were, even just as the baseline, and then start getting better? So that's the patience. How long does the organization have for that willingness to have? And in lower maturity organizations, they will often panic and under the stress, and they will abort their initiative, and they will hit a failure point as a result of this. And we see this as very common, that very few of these big bang transformations are successful. Only 18% outright success. 64% have some degree of moderate effectiveness, and 18% are outright failures. And this is by the Product Management Institute that was evaluating change initiatives. So not a very stellar performance. And so these challenges that we have with evolutionary change, we try to take a different approach in the Kanban method. So Kanban in action, we try to avoid these failure modes of these large designed up front, and instead approach it with evolutionary change. Smaller changes that we can, smaller designed experiments that we continue to evolve and reach a higher level of evolution. So evolutionary change in action, we start with some initial state. That's what part of the Kanban method is start with what you do now. We evaluate the fitness. We look at how we're doing. Based on that, this experiment. And we roll that too, check out that experiment. We evaluate the fitness of that. Well, look, not too bad. We continue forward. We try that, look at evaluate the fitness there, and say, whoops, let's roll that back a little bit. Maybe start, design something new and roll it forward. See where we go from there, run a couple more experiments, and eventually the state becomes emergent. So as we keep looking at this. And this is the approach of the Kanban method, is a evolutionary change using designed experiments, measuring the results, providing feedback loops that provide us with a higher maturity organization, a higher maturity implementation as we go forward. So with that, this brings forth the change management principles of the Kanban method. And of course, number one, start with what you do now. Not what you say you do now, but what you actually do now. Let's understand it. Let's really fully, deeply understand what is done now, because only by understanding what it is, by fully understanding what is done, can we actually improve it. And in part of that is also respecting roles, responsibilities, job titles. We're not changing all of that. We gain agreement to pursue improvement through evolutionary change. And then we take some active leadership at all levels. That's what brings the feedback loop. Taking the active leadership is completing the feedback loop and actually making something happen. So water flows around the rock. This is part of our evolutionary change approach as well. We don't try to go directly at the resistance. We look at what the resistance is, and we look for ways around the resistance. And this is part of evolutionary change. Let's look for the path that gets us, that continues our flow to happen and allows us to continue. Oftentimes, the resistance just becomes one of those if-onlys. So our approach to the if-only is to say, well, what about doing something different? And that's going around the rock.
Great, thank you, Todd. So remember, start with where you are and then evolve from there. Don't try and define something in the future. Encourage better alignment and collaboration between the groups. So don't reorganize, don't try to transform, try to evolve instead, and really focus on knowing where you are right now and improving the communication where you are. So we're not thinking of reorganizing into squads, pods, chapters, flocks, herds, packs, or mobs. Those are good to have maybe in other organizations, but when we're using the Kanban method, we don't have to have that to succeed. So keep in mind, reorganization itself, we seem to think of it as not being pragmatic, not really actionable. Ultimately, it is unpopular in most organizations after it's done for a few months. Typically, it can be resisted in most organizations, especially if they've been around for 20, 30, 40 years or more, and they're trying to modernize what they're doing. They're trying to start evolving. The idea of reorganization is going to throw a big curveball at a lot of culture. And typically, this also causes long delays because there's this humongous timeline for how they think things should go in terms of reorganizing. So no one gets a new role here in Kanban. No responsibilities are added on or a job title. It really is start with what you do now. Where are we and how are we currently behaving and how are we operating? And so you don't have to send someone on a 2-day training course. There's no need for that. And then have them come back and say, well, now your new job title is here, get started, go at it. Instead, we say, start with where you are, see what your challenges are, and then start to improve from there. And yeah, possibly get some training to help you along the way, but it's not required to succeed here. So remember, forced identity change, while it's fun, it's something that can be done by human resources. It's a really cool new badge to wear, so to speak. I'm now this new type of role. It probably will invoke more passive-aggressive behavior, where people were happy with where they were in the organizational structure. They enjoyed their titles. They might have wanted to keep that title, and now that's being dispensed like yesterday's garbage. That's not the case with the Kanban method. So we need some better, more pragmatic, actionable, evidence-based guidance to help people make their evolutionary change successful. And Todd?
And for us, that comes in the form of the Kanban Maturity Model. So the Kanban Maturity Model is a model that David Anderson and Theodore Bosova have been working on for a number of years and have published the first edition book as well as now the second edition version of the Kanban Maturity Model book. And really what the Kanban Maturity Model is all about is codifying this evolutionary path. What have we seen over many years of Kanban implementations is a best path for Kanban implementation, a roadmap for Kanban implementation. It's mapping out 150 specific Kanban practices to observable business outcomes using 7 levels of maturity. And it's based on the culture, the practices, and outcomes. And outcomes is a key part of this. It really want to focus on the outcomes. Are we getting the outcomes we need? Are we getting the outcomes we care about? If we are, then that's great. That's fantastic. But if we're not getting the outcomes that we're asking for, if we're not having say an outcome what we want is predictability, if we're not getting that, then we want to go back and look at what are the practices that we need in order to get that type of outcome. And so from that's where we get to the maturity model, going from level 0 to level 6. And we'll go through that a little bit more in detail. But A design element of the Kanban maturity model was to eliminate two of the common failure modes that we see in Kanban and Agile implementations. One is where we overreach. The organization's at a low maturity level, and it says, oh, I got to have some of that Agile stuff. I got to have some of that Kanban stuff. And it goes out for tries to take on too much. It's not ready to make that big of a change. It's like that big J curve. It tries to take on too much, and as it results, it overreaches, causing an aborted start. So that's one of the problems. The second one is that an organization does a change and they reach a false summit plateau. They get a little bit of improvement. They were in maybe they were in level 0, very much overburdened. They had too much work going on, and they did something and removed the overburdening, and then everyone's in a happy place now. But they've just barely scratched the of what they could possibly do. They can do much more. So they've reached the false summit plateau, and there's an opportunity for them to reach far more benefit if they were to follow the Kanban Maturity Model roadmap. So let's go back to look at our J curve. We look at the J curve on and this, taking on too much is overreaching. Too big of a change is overreaching. It results in a big drop in initial performance, and that often results in a failed implementation. The other one is reaching a false summit plateau, getting out of that big dip, and then getting to a point where you're happier now, and failing to reach that incremental benefit that's possible by continuing the journey. So stopping the evolution basically at that point, because you don't want to go through that big, painful J curve again. So you just stop at that point and miss the benefit.
So in terms of the maturity model, one of the things that we're looking at is how you get started. And so you might be in the oblivious area, which is my way, which really is everyone is busy, but no one knows what they're producing. It's confusion. So we've got people who are thinking individualistically. The service that they're providing as a cohesive group perhaps is unpredictable, unreliable, and they feel overburdened. These are people who are tending to work more than 8 hours a day, probably 10 to 15 hours a day easily. And what results of that is customers are not happy. You've got managers who feel like they don't really have a control or an understanding of how things are working. And the people involved in all of this, from the customers to the managers to the employees, not really happy. So how do you solve for that? We recommend in the maturity model that you look at visualizing your work at the team level. Put yourselves into an aggregate team view and say, what are we all working on as a group? And then limiting how much you might want to do. That's a huge decision right there. That changes it from a push-based system or a hidden system to now something that actually pulls through pretty confidently. And defining some initial policies. A very good initial policy is, what do we start working on and how do we agree on that we're going to start doing something new? Very simple, but very powerful. And then the feedback loops that we recommend, a very simple one. Every day or every other day, get together and talk about what work is moving along the board and who can help out with that work. So changing the focus from the individual and maybe the oblivious level of work to something that is more team-oriented, that has more of a focus around actually getting some achievement done with the work as a group. So that leads us to ML1, which is really the team-focused perspective, which the challenge here is not so much who is working on what, but that we never do it the same way twice. We always seem to struggle to get the consistency that we're looking for here. And an example that we see in the field from a very popular internet equipment manufacturer was that they had said, hey, every team reports that they're delivering on their commitments, but I know the actual time that customers take is longer than 6 months. So here's something we consider: using a service-oriented workflow board and performing a flow review. This means actually having a board that is aimed at the customer's needs and focusing on giving them what they need from a customer point of view with service as the target. What are we providing them? How long will it take us to get it to them? What kinds of things are they asking for? That's the beginning of a service-oriented workflow board. And a flow review is really looking at how long does it take to get that work done? What kind of work are we doing? And how reliable are we at doing this work? So there are a lot of benefits from moving into an ML1 state. Now, when you look at ML2, This is really where you're growing up and you know your customers, either by type of customer or by name. And you have maybe one challenge here. You might not have the same result twice. And what you're finding is you're starting to work together pretty clearly. You're having some challenges though. You have managers who are trying to hero things in to get things resolved. And those things in particular focus on delays and some last minute tension that come up because there isn't good coordination, there isn't good collaboration. So you're starting to say who you know your customer is, you're starting to have some good flow, but at times it's a lot of heroics at the near end of this to actually get it done. And this happens in a lot of large organizations and some small startup ones for sure. We see this pattern happen a lot. And here are some things that we consider in particular that you should think about. Actually putting together technology or tools that allow you to collect lead time and report on lead time really effectively. In particular, looking for where things can get stuck. And in that way, you also have a service delivery manager, someone who wears a hat, not a job title, but really a hat that they might wear from time to time, where they're supporting the delivery of work. They're helping to remove those delays. They're getting ahead of the typical managerial heroic behavior. And then on the flip side, someone who's wearing a hat, or maybe someone who's also wearing the service delivery manager role, might wear the service delivery review role. They might take on that facilitation of getting through the data. So when they instrument and report lead time, they're also going to discuss what comes out of that lead time. That's a service delivery review. How well are we doing? Are we becoming reliable in our work? Are we becoming predictable in what we do? And are we really getting close to being fit for purpose for our customers? That's the maturity that we're aiming for as we get better with ML2. And here's an example of what that looks like. You can see how it has a board with ideas ready, developed, all the way to deploy ready. And you'll notice how there are WIP limits in the columns above. And some of those columns have 5, 3, 5, and 3. And the idea here is this system is limited. It creates a pull-based behavior. We pull when we have capacity to do so. It's a big deal. Psychologically, it's a big change in the organizational way of working. And that's a key effect of using a pull-based system. Now, if you do that, you will find yourself probably in fit for purpose, which is a great place to be. I've been there personally as a coach and as a consultant, and it's a fascinating place to be where things are actually predictable. You're actually able to manage the flow of the work. And there are no more heroes anymore. The process is under control, and we actually find ways to start thinking more creatively about how we do our work. We no longer feel that pressure to constantly go out there and rescue work that's in our environment. Now, if we do that, we find ourselves a little bit more mature in terms of understanding how to risk hedge. We're looking at no more surprises. We actually understand how to mitigate all the risks coming through our environment. It's really powerful. And so everyone is actually happy in this case because they're able to mitigate a lot of potential risks way early on. They're able to triage work way before it gets to them. They're understanding how to mitigate the market demand, and they're actually able to mitigate a lot of customer changes in our environment. So it's really powerful stuff there when you're looking at risk hedge maturity level 4. Now, one step beyond that is market leader. Now, this is definitely a leap beyond just simply hedging for risk. We are simply the best in the market. Everyone looks to us. They know us to be the best at what we do. This is truly organizational change and the result of why I think a lot of organizations want to transform. They want to stay the best or continue to work in that direction to be the best. And so what you find are marginal gains and very much an attention to detail. This is what you find as like teams and organizations that seamlessly work well together. You've probably experienced this in your field of life, somewhere in work, where you've actually had this kind of market leader experience when you consume something. Now, the last phase of the last sort of maturity level, I should say, is built for survival. And that is really reinvention. This is a way that the organization continually challenges its identity. It's looking for a new identity and a new purpose. It simply doesn't accept the best only. It wants to be better than the best. And this is really what we're talking about when we're thinking about built for survival. Now, an example of that we can refer to in our history here in the US is the idea of the Wright Cycle Company. Now, most people know about the Wright brothers, but it's worth reminding them they were basically bicycle people before they actually became people who manufactured airplanes. And they simply worked through the idea of what can we do with our business? What else can we achieve? And one of those things happened to be the idea of experimenting with airplanes. So evolutionary change in particular in the Kanban Maturity Model have an interesting relationship here. And I wanted to highlight this to you. So going back to what Todd showed you earlier, we have a start with where you are now kind of approach. So you might find yourself at maturity level 0. That's much like this kid right here on the tricycle, just getting started with the idea of riding a bike. We think a bike is important, but we're not quite sure. And then at level 1, we realize there's beneficial growth here. We can actually mature a bit more and apply a little bit more stress and grow up. And so you'll notice here, we said, look, let's use the 2-wheel bicycle, but let's put some training wheels on it so we can safely mature in this path. So we have some guidance for how to transition into this. And then eventually we might do something called consolidation. When consolidation happens, we say, hey, let's get rid of the training wheels. Let's really try and do this independently. So at level 2, we might say, now we're more mature. Now we can really get beyond this. And we're going to try and ride the bike without training wheels. The problem is, and most of you probably experienced this in your lives, you might fall down, you might hurt yourself, you might realize, I need to go back to those training wheels. I'm not confident yet to move to this next level. That's okay. So in the maturity model and in the Kanban method, sometimes you evolve and sometimes you might devolve a little bit because the stress is too much. You might have overreached. So as we move beyond that, we find that eventually we get used to the idea of the training wheels. We take those off. We get very comfortable riding the bike by ourselves. And then eventually we start doing tricks or other things. We start to realize we can mature better. So in this concept of evolution, using the bicycle metaphor, what we're finding is we can evolve and mature to be more fit for our purpose. And so as we get beyond level 3 and move into level 4, which really focuses on this risk hedging approach, we can do some really crazy fun things with our business. So in this case, if our business was competitively riding bikes, we could definitely take out a bike for mud riding. We could take a bike out for racing on the road. We have so many options at our disposal. And that's what we're after here, is giving people more options, giving organizations more options for evolution. And so this is, again, a continuing model of evolutionary change here. This is not something that we expect to be done and over with. It continues to grow over time. So with that, levels 5 and 6 are really important to mention here. So levels 5 and 6, you're simply the best. What do you do beyond that, right? You reinvent yourself to do something beyond bicycles. So in this case, if you're competitively riding bicycles, you might go into something completely different and branch out beyond that. And that is reinvention here. Some of you have probably used Virgin-based products, which is based out of the UK. That's a really good example of a company that keeps reinventing itself time and again. First, it was, I think, records, then airplanes, and now they're into space flight. Who knows what they'll do next, but they are constantly reinventing themselves.
So stop starting and start finishing. That's our Kanban proverb David Anderson came up with. It was, we're seeing it, and it's a very appropriate thing. Too many things get started. We need to keep finishing. So in the same vein, what do we talk about with regards to organizations and transformations? So to me, it's stop the big bang transformations that frequently deliver small changes and start small changes using evolutionary change to get transformational results. Stop focusing on the flow of power. Start focusing on the flow of work. Right? Organizations, reorganizations is all about flow of power. Let's start focusing on the work. That's where we can get the real value. Focus on the work, not the workers. It's one of our principles. So if we're going to reorganize something, what I'd say is reorganize the work, not the workers. All right. And stop the wishful thinking of what you want to be. Start the reality check of where you're at and the small wins to move forward.
So, yes. So here at Kanban University, we have a couple of things to get you started. In particular, we have a free guide that you can download today on our website. If you go to kanban.university, you'll find the official guide to the Kanban method. And that's actually a very short graphic depiction of what the Kanban method is and how it works. You can also attend one of our trainings from one of our accredited trainers here in Brazil or throughout the world. But definitely there are some great ones in Brazil. I can't tell you how awesome the trainers are there. So that's another great way to get started with your Kanban learning. And if you want to go a little bit further, you can contact a coaching professional. We have lots of KCPs out in the Brazil area, as well as throughout the world, who are really interested in just talking with you about Kanban. They're willing and open to share a lot more about how this method works and how it helps your organization to evolve. And then lastly, if you want to go beyond that and really plan out an engagement that's larger scale, then that's probably one where an accredited consultant can help you out and helping you to figure out how to let the evolution take place within your organization without designing this big plan up front. And that's something that they're really good at doing these days. And there are a lot of great ones throughout the world, as well as Brazil.
So if we look at how does it work in practice, there's a great case study that we have on utilizing the Kanban Maturity Model at Vanguard. And this was done by one of our coaches, David Hughes. And this was an organization, they had been working with Scrum for a number of years, and they had sort of hit that plateau at a point where they weren't getting much better. They'd been at it for a while, they were doing okay, but they weren't getting much better, and they were feeling a little bit unhappy because they weren't getting better. And they came in and started looking at Kanban and started using it, implementing Kanban. And within 90 days of implementing Kanban and also the enterprise services planning component of Kanban, you can see their lead time chart drop drastically. They were able to improve 78% within 90 days. And the other thing, as part of that, was they also had very few outliers. So there was nothing in that area, in that box there you see, where they're in the old ways of working, they had a lot of outliers, a lot of late things. And with the new focus on Kanban, they were able to drastically improve their lead time. And this was in a very short period of time. And even as you go look at their cumulative flow diagram, and they called this Scrum stall. So Scrum stall was where they had stalled out with their Scrum implementation, and Kanban came in and was able to, without changing where they were at now, they started implementing new things. They were able to make these improvements and get some very, this wasn't a big transformation, but they did get what I would call transformational results. If we look at the cumulative flow diagram, as they had been aggressive passing along here, you sort of looked at their initial state while they were working with Scrum and maybe early implementations of some of the Kanban work. They were in sort of a KMM level 1 to 2. And as they started implementing some of the practices and able to take their maturity to a level 3, their performance went significant. So in addition to reducing lead time, they also improved their throughput by about a factor of 4. So huge improvements by implementing the Kanban Maturity Model there at Vanguard. This is also, we see this repeatedly. Now, this was not usually explicitly utilizing the Kanban Maturity Model, but here's a report back from a group at Accenture Brazil. And before they took the Kanban system design, the KMP1, their performance was mediocre. But immediately, really after implementing some of the ideas from the KMP1 class, huge improvement in throughput. And we saw this recently from another trainer, same type of behavior, where almost immediately after coming back from training, they were able to get significant improvement in performance. These are cases that happen repeatedly. We see these results, and it's just a matter of taking on small changes and getting some very big results. And one last thing about the Brazilian market is we're seeing, well, the Latin American market in particular, we're seeing a huge growth. It's great. It's great that we're seeing the growth we're seeing. Tribute to a lot of the work that Rodrigo and others have done in building up the market in Brazil. You can see that Kanban in general had been growing until 2020, where we had a bit of a hit from COVID impact, definitely in North America and in Europe. But in Latin America, the growth has just been phenomenal, and even something as a pandemic didn't stop that growth. So great to see that growth, and we're great to see some of our trainers out there that are going to continue that growth. So love to see what we can do in really taking off with Kanban. It's clearly a method that works, and there's great opportunities for improvements around the globe.
Thanks, Todd. And so that's us. That's Todd Little and Joey Spooner here from Kanban University talking to you about the preventable pandemics.
Okay, guys. Do you listen to myself?
I can hear you.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm not showing up.
Because I see you as well.
You see me. Okay. Okay, guys. Thank you for your keynote. I think that there's not a lot of questions. You know, the people were cheering a lot on the chat, so you did a good job. But let me ask you something, and I guess that this may be something that everybody wants to know. Why do you think that? What do you think the motivation for the big transformations and the reorgs? What do you think that is the, Todd, you talk a lot about the Moore's technology curve. You see that transformations is it's past the chasm or not. So, I think that this seems to be growing, but this is just the two questions that what's the motivation, and if you think that it's going mainstream already, or it's going down. So
yeah, I think the motivation for transformation and reorganization is a bit of impatience, and I think it's also partially has been fueled by a consulting model that works. So we've got big consultants coming in saying, "Oh, here's your problem. Here's your current state, and you need to be at this future state."
It works for the consultancy, right?
The consultants can make money from it, right? Whether it works for the customer is a whole different problem. I think it's a model that, and I think that somehow the feedback loop of that is really poor because nobody wants to admit to a failed transformation either, right? So there's too much at stake from an individual perspective and an image perspective that people won't really acknowledge the failures. So the feedback loop of saying, "Hey, don't do what these consultants are saying," is just not there. But the reality is, I think there's the failures we see all the time. It's just I think a lot of people keep a blind eye to it.
Okay, and you showed up some numbers that are really impressive because we don't hear about people failing on this kind of transformations. I see that, at least here in Brazil, people seems to be happy with it. So, I know we are going through a transformation. This seems to be working, and I'm not sure, to whom this is working. So that's something that is really amazing, in my opinion. Okay, guys. There's a question from the audience. Alejandro, he asked us, what if you have a lot of a turnover? If the turnover rate is high, this is something that's a big factor to hinder the maturity level of companies. I think that just want to hear a comment from you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question of cause and effect, right? Because is the high turnover rate causing the lower or keeping the maturity back, or is the low maturity resulting in a high turnover? And I think it's probably a bit of each, and it's a cyclic game that it's hard to get out of. This is one of those cases where evolutionary change, I think, is huge, because trying to make a big change out of essentially there's a reinforcing loop here, which is, I don't like the company, so I'm going to leave, and then it just and as it leaves, it prevents the company from getting better. So I think you need to do some small changes that stop the bleeding a little bit, and see how that type of works, because you've got to get, rather than again trying to jump big, you have to jump small, and then eventually that will start healing itself. Joey, you have a comment on it?
Yeah, actually, I have two comments on it. I think the older companies that tend to want to try and transform feel like that's the approach that they should take because that's what they've done with everything else. Remember, these are organizations that came through the 80s and 90s, quite likely, with big investments on technology. And they assumed that in order to modernize the organization behaviorally, that they should also make a big investment, and that's how they should do it, period. There's no really other option on the table. Because the feedback is that they want something that's 2 years in feedback. They don't want something that's in 6 months or 2 months. They can't handle that mentally in some ways. I believe that to be the case. And in terms of the turnover rate, Alejandro pointed out a very good cause of what I would call devolution. You take your core people and give them a reason to leave, and boom, your organization will likely devolve. It actually lose the quality of service it once had because that intellectual knowledge is gone. And one of the key things that I think we look at here in the Kanban method is how do we actually create a safe, stable environment for you to do your work in? That's really at ML2 when we start limiting the WIP and looking at your customer, maybe even at ML1 possibly as well. But once you reach those levels, suddenly I don't feel so stressed. Gosh, I can actually get my job done. And my employer cares about me, the work that we're doing, and in particular, my customer. If we can deliver on that, then why do I want to leave, right? If the hours are good and the work is fun. And I think that's what you're finding is a lot of organizations, their maturity and operating at a level of chaos to where now it's at a tipping point.
Yes, you know that here in Brazil, what is happening is people are leaving the companies they're operating here because they can work overseas from home, and this is one of the biggest impact that we have on the workforce here in Brazil. So I think that people are, now bombing us with questions. They got inspired in the conversation. So,
yeah.
Veronica has a good one here. I see that you were reading. The room names at Kanban Brazil are Ono and Goldratt, two great persons from the Lean Toyota and tier of constraints. Okay. Tell me how much Lean is the Kanban method? That's a good one.
No, that's a great question. And yes, I would say
because, we dropped the name, right? We dropped the name Lean something like 3 years ago, right?
Yeah, no, we dropped the name Lean from the company name, and there were particular reasons for that, obviously. But it's clear that the foundation of Lean is still key to the Kanban method. Everything, the work of Ono and Goldratt are key elements of the Kanban method. I think the big reason that we really wanted to focus on the Kanban side of things was that from a knowledge work perspective, there is a difference between the Kanban method and lean manufacturing. And the primary difference that I call out is that in lean manufacturing, it's really all about waste reduction. That's the fundamental element really is trying to reduce waste. Whereas in knowledge work, and the reason for that is because there's not a high amount of uncertainty. Whereas in knowledge work, there's huge amounts of uncertainty. And when you have huge amounts of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is not something you really want, you're not necessarily trying to squash the uncertainty. What you're really trying to do is manage the uncertainty effectively. And that is a difference, a huge difference of the Kanban method for knowledge work. And so I think that's the reason for trying to differentiate the two, but foundationally, all of the lean principles, essentially all of the lean elements are still embedded in the Kanban method, and it's a key part of what we have in the Kanban method.
Okay, good. There's a good one from Pedro. Pedro asks how to convince executives that reorgs and transformations are bad. They are not exactly the better solution.
Joy, you take it first. And
Okay, yeah, thanks, Todd. So I think one of the things that often gets missed when using the Kanban method that people don't realize that's beneficial to executives is, how about we get feedback on your transformation starting in a month or less? And that probably is contradictory to what they're used to hearing from other organizations that might sell them on transformations, where the idea is we're going to show you progress by changing the organizational structure, or show you progress by looking at how much we've reorganized and how much we've tooled ourselves up with technology. That really isn't the important piece. The important piece is, are we having meaningful conversations to improve how we operate the organization, and what key factors are we going to look at? That ties back to fitness for purpose. So a lot of times the hyper-focusedness is around moving pieces on a chessboard, when it really should be about, hey, wait a minute, this is about really how we communicate changing in an evolutionary manner over time relatively quickly, so we can learn and adapt better to our market and what it needs. So I tend to look at that as the timeline piece of this as one very big factor in talking with executives and saying, how about I give you something faster? And usually they're like, yeah, I would love something faster. Great. This is one way to do that. Yeah.
Nice.
Todd?
Yeah, I'd say the key thing is show, don't tell. I mean, this is realizing that they're going through, they need something, they need confidence that it's going to work for them. So there's small incremental wins, I think, is a huge way to go about it. Get the buy-in, say, how about we try something, right? Let's see what we can do with a short try. And the key part then is you're only taking on a little bit, but if you can show some good wins from that, that's your opportunity for the next level. And demonstrating this is not the end of it. We can keep doing more of this, right? This is just the start point. But stories, emotional change, it's all about getting the buy-in, trying to win them over with lots of, we think of ourselves as logical people, trying to win them over with data, things like that. It can make a dent, but it's not really the thing that's going to win. It's going to come from showing and stories.
Yeah, that's nice. And I think that this is one of the things that we, as a community, we can start looking for. I think that maybe we need to talk a little bit more about storytelling, at least on our KCP program. So this is something for later.
Great point. Yeah.
You're talking to the guy who's working on the KCP. So yeah.
Yes. The next one is from Girlene Borba. How to work on managers' mindset change when they are used to a traditional model, top-down transformation.
Yes. So the best answer is if you can get your idea to become their idea, so that they think they own it, right? So if they can buy into it, again, I think it's similar challenge you have with anyone who's making a decision, is you've got to get into their decision-making process, which is largely going to be some sort of, there's probably going to be some deep emotional issue that you're going to have to penetrate in some fashion. It's not generally going to come from logic. It can also be a personal thing. What is it that means something to them, and then start going after that. So discover where they're how they're making the decisions. Work with them emotionally. Work with them through storytelling, and start. See if you can start. Hey, let's try an experiment. Right? Let's try an experiment that would. That even if we fail, it's not going to be a big problem. Let's learn something.
Right. And in particular, one of the behaviors that I see with managers like this, Rodrigo, is that they feel like they've got to control things very tightly for success to happen. And part of what Todd's describing is give a little space and have them think through, how do I actually open up a little space for change to take place without my control, and just let it naturally evolve right in front of me, without it exploding in my face. So there's a lot that goes on here. In fact, at Kanban Global Summit in 2022 Global Summit, we'll have an actual lab exercise on experimentation. And that's a really good example of how to think about what is an experiment, what's a reasonable amount of experimentation that I can try without allowing my full control mindset to take over and say, I've got to control everything and remove all variability. So really you as a coach, Girlene, if you're a coach, go do it. If you're not a coach, go talk with a coach who's been trained in the Kanban method for coaching, because we talk a lot about how to introduce stressors and also how to engage with certain levels of identity like a manager. So that's a great problem to address. I like it.
Yes.
Yeah, the other thing I would say on this one is search for the sources of dissatisfaction. Where is the manager dissatisfied? And that gives you your opening. The approach we use in static.
Exactly. Okay, guys, I think that we need to finish. Todd and Joey, thank you for your time. Thank you for you to, thank you for covering David. And I think that it was quite, fit for the purpose of the conference. So thank you guys, and see you there. I hope to see you next year in the conference in US, but I'm not
Absolutely.
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for
We don't have visas here in Brazil, so the embassy is closed, so that will be a quite of a challenge for us to attend. So,
Yeah.
okay, guys, thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.